said in a session earlier today that really great companies change the way people behave. So they may raise people's capabilities or competences in certain ways. And we tend to neglect that. When we think about companies, we think about technology or services and what we sell. But great companies change people. And I want to come round to that. I'm going to talk first of all about some structural changes within organisations. And then I want to focus on what it is that companies do to people, or how that iterative relationship improves the human condition. So to start with the structural changes, I'm going to talk about 4 big shifts. And I'm going to start with externalisation. Really great companies are externalising core processes. And what we tend to think when if you've been to business school, you're told you must respect the core, you must develop the core, and core competency is the core strategy, as it were. But great companies are shifting away from that. And they're externalising core processes. And the most obvious, the most frequent response I get to that is, oh, well, don't you just mean outsourcing? And I don't mean outsourcing, I mean that companies are externalising core processes. You generally speaking outsource something that's not core to your business. And one simple example of externalisation would be at Twitter or Facebook, where you will be now trying to attract your advocates or the people that tweet or write about your company and somehow enlist them in your marketing campaigns. And that's one example of externalisation. Another would be, for example, the train manufacturer Bombardier, who've externalised accident risk onto their brake manufacturers. So it doesn't need to be something as social as Facebook. It can be really deep in the weeds of what a company does. But the most important thing is that they're trying to externalise that. And I want to place that externalisation in context now, because I think what we're seeing is a very significant transformation in the way organisations are formed and what they'll look like in future. And it goes back some years. So to kind of illustrate that, I did some research for the Harvard Business Review a couple of years ago. And in that research, I looked at these recessionary periods, 1990, 2000, 2007, and the boom period, 2004, 2006. And what I was looking for was to find out what business writers had said about business. What is business getting wrong, actually? We were looking at failure specifically. What are the difficulties that businesses were encountering during these periods? The first one, if you go back to 1990, people were preoccupied with the idea of services, this transition from an industrial type of business to a service type of business. And it was felt that that was one of the key elements of that recession, that companies were simply not getting that right. 10 years later, if you look at what people were talking about, it was still the problem of transformation to a service economy. But now they were blaming employees. Employees were not becoming customer-centric enough. And I know you now have a customer-centric strategy here, but that's been a part of the transformation for at least 10, 15 years. And most organisations actually struggled with that for an awful long time. So going to 2000, it was about employees. By the time you get to 2004, it was about the CEO. So our CEO was competent enough to exploit the upturn, that long upturn that suddenly came to a halt in 2008. But the issue was still the same. Are they doing enough to exploit this service layer that we're trying to map onto production companies? In 2007, 2010, that dialogue changes dramatically. So instead of looking at these internal aspects of the firm, so the employee, the internal transformation towards a service-centric company, it's all about external risk. And those external risks can be a wide range of things. So it could be competition from China, it could be political risk, it could be ecological risk. Whatever it is, people were talking about risk. And I think there's no coincidence, and why I started with the idea of externalisation is because for the past 5 years, the external environment has become far more important. And you might say, in a sense, it's always important, because you sell to an external body of people called customers. But actually, it's becoming important because you need to cooperate with your ecosystem in order to make that happen now. And just as in the past you needed to manage an employee base, you somehow now need to find ways to manage an ecosystem or an external environment that's beyond the reach of normal management. So what it gets externalized, I think, in the core, and I'm sorry for the small writing, but I'll spell some of it out. Companies will now, if you depend on the design of an interface, or if you're a hardware manufacturer and you need that device to look good in comparison with something like the iPhone, it's not untypical to go to an external agency or to work with a design partner to get that right. Whereas in the past, that design was absolutely about your identity and you would not entrust it to an external partner. I mentioned social media. There's also the ecosystem. If you look at the big American software companies, but also a South Korean one like Samsung, they are developing these large ecosystems of apps developers that they don't outsource to. We're not outsourcing, we're talking about externalizing a key process. And I think that what we're going through, I just want to touch on this briefly and come back to it because I said I want to talk about 4 shifts. We're going from that production orientated economy to one where we try to map a service layer onto it. And we're going on towards something now where you have to think very differently about the kinds of things that you engage with as a management team. And instead of the old siloed IT infrastructure or programmatic strategy, the 3 or 5 year plan, or your closed R&D labs, in this sector you would not have them, but many companies did. We moved in this service area towards object-orientated computing, towards knowledge management, agile management, these types of terms. But now it's all about platform, cloud, mobility, apps, externalization, ideation, crowdsourcing, crowdfunding. It's a totally different language of business and all illustrates an external environment which you simply cannot manage with the same efficiency that you managed in the past. So different things are happening because of that, and I'm going to go on to shift number 2, which is that I think what companies are able to do, really smart companies that have externalized a lot of core process, they're now being much more radical in the markets that they pursue. And I've called that radical adjacency because in the past when you learned about business and you learned about your core process, you avoided adjacencies of all kinds. You didn't go trying new markets necessarily, maybe some new geographic markets. I know you lost 7 billion in London, but that's not an untypical consequence of going into new markets in the old days. So you were taught not to do adjacencies, but suddenly what we're seeing is companies are doing really very radical adjacencies. One illustration there, the Apple store, I think that's in New York. So who would have thought 15 years ago that Apple would be the most effective retailer on the planet? There's no reason why it should have been. But given that it has not had to manage the development of a 300,000 strong app community, there's been executive time to go and say, well, where do we want our competency to be? We want it in extra margin. We'll open up in retail and we'll become the best retailer in the world. And you see a lot of American companies doing that, and I think it's going to be a necessary component of any strategy going forward. So you see Apple went into smartphones, it's now excelled in retail, Microsoft in telephony, not just with Skype, but Microsoft are now building out infrastructure in Africa. They now call themselves a device company. They've moved on from being an OS and software company. Google into mobile. They recently bought Lending Club, which is a peer-to-peer lender, I think the biggest peer-to-peer lender. They're moving into autos through the driverless car. Walmart trying to open a bank. So you see people moving into businesses where you think, well, they've no right to be there. They've no competency there, but they have. And they're managing to discover competency and to hire competency. And I think that also says that your threats might not in the future come from small startups, though they're still going to come from there, but they're going to come from big companies that just decide that one part of your business is a valid market for them. A third related shift is the move towards a device economy. What you see here is somebody going into a Disney theme park. So they're wearing a device on their wrist. The reader takes information about everything that they do as they go through the park, collects data on them, then suggests back new alternatives or new options or better preferences for them. But I think more and more of our activity is being mediated by devices, and more will be. Ericsson, the telecoms infrastructure provider, reckons there'll be 500 billion devices by 2020, so just 7 years away. And you see now we read via a device. Some people still use books, a lot of people do, but they read via a device, they connect socially via devices, they even do their cooking with a device open next to them, and a lot of travel is mediated by a device as well. So we're going to go full circle. We moved away from this hardware-centric economy, the production industrial economy. We went to this service layer. We are now moving back to, I think, towards a hardware-centric economy. I think a lot of economies, a lot of governments are going to regret having moved out of manufacturing because clearly there are 500 billion devices to be made. The fourth related shift I'm going to call narrow innovation, because another aspect of what's happening is that if you think about how people innovate now, it's not about the big shift. It's not about that big thing that happened, for example, in the media industry where we went from print to digital. We've done that. We went digital. It's now about how many different types of apps you're going to create around your content so that you can serve much more narrow markets. You know, you don't publish your newspaper, I mean, some companies obviously still do, but on your website what you're trying to do is to capture and satisfy much narrower markets. And you see it also in a product like Google Glass, the heads-up display that Google's going to launch later this year, which I think exemplifies many of the features of the new economy. So when Google took that product, they actually modified a heads-up display, refined the design, but then went out to the community and said, what would you want to do with this? And they got thousands of responses through Twitter. It was actually the ideation campaign was run on Twitter. They then went from that kind of mass ideation campaign to their developer community and said, are there 2,000 developers prepared to pay $1,500 to get one of these glasses and develop apps for them? So by the time it launches, actually Google's done very little. Its ecosystem has done a huge amount. It's already got massive publicity. It's got a very engaged audience waiting for this product. But also it's going to be a product that serves very narrow niches because those 2,000 apps are not going to be downloaded by everybody. And the permutations that 2,000 apps gives you means you're probably going to serve some thousands of narrow markets. You know, people who've got a primary interest in productivity, people who've got a primary interest in travel or in health monitoring, whatever those markets are going to be, and in whatever languages, at whatever price points, you can do that now through one product, one device. So part of what's going on is this shift to narrow innovation, the need to create hundreds, if not thousands of innovations, thousands of changes in what you do, find ways to manage hundreds and thousands of changes at the same time. I think driven partly by the global middle class. I think that's one of the things that's going to drive. And I think there is a technology and social driver anyway. We're going in that direction. But it's also appropriate because we now have, or we will have, a global middle class of 2 billion people, not that 300 million people, those 300 million Americans, Europeans and Australians, which had a fairly homogenous culture and represented a mass market. Anyway, this future global middle class is going to have a whole range of income levels and a whole range of requirements. So being able to do narrow innovation and being able at the same time to be radical in your innovation, I think is a really important trend. And you see it in companies like Samsung, which is, if you think back, you know, about 6 weeks ago, Samsung launched the S4. Within 5 weeks, they announced 4 variants of the S4. So actually the S4 is already 5 products, and you can well imagine over the next 12 months it becomes a dozen products. And that's the kind of thing that's happening because Samsung has cracked the nut on hardware innovation, on narrow innovation in hardware. Look at Google. Google's probably doing that quite well in software innovation, but in services innovation, you don't see so much of it, and it's still waiting to be done. So to return to this idea that we're transitioning from that old production to this newer service, to this elastic era, I think what's important for most companies to realize is you coexist in these different eras. You effectively have at least 3 innovation cultures or 3 technology cultures or 3 business cultures that you have to manage at the same time because you're never going to become this elastic enterprise. You're always going to have a foot in services and a foot in that old industrial era. And I imagine that one of your problems here, if you don't have this problem, you're very novel as a financial institution, is that you've got lots of legacy IT. And you won't escape it quickly, but you'll obviously be developing all kinds of new types of IT. So we need to, I think, recognize that we have these different cultures and we need different structures and that we need to co-manage them and that there isn't some kind of magic bullet that's going to take you from one to the other or preferably from one to the third. So I'm going to give you a close-up of a couple of these things and then I want to move into that idea that actually what we sell to each other is not this technology. The technology is a way to engage people in enhancing their personal capabilities. But just to finish off with this section, a typical company in the past would have a closed R&D lab, they'd have their PhD scientists, they'd invent things like nylon, they'd have a marketing department, they could sell it. So, you know, the kind of companies we're talking about, probably a bit like yours, oligopolistic, they could push product into market and had the marketing budgets to make sure they got uptake. And we saw over the past 15 years that kind of system breaking down, oligopoly power broke down, and companies started to reach out to these external communities like through open innovation and trying to draw in customers and say, you know, tell us more about what you want and then we'll build it. So I think we went from closed R&D to open innovation, which is fantastic, but I think that that's becoming less relevant. I think it's still important, but I think what's important now is that you actually become a different type of organisation. I don't think many conventional historical organisations are capable of doing this very quickly, but you see, at least in the tech sector, that companies are adopting this radical adjacency model and not seeing any confines. They're going after whatever markets they choose. And I think that's where innovation's at. That's the leading edge of it. And it plays out through these ecosystems. And we have a very poor understanding of what ecosystems mean. We know that there's something that happens with some companies like Apple. Their brand power attracts a lot of people in, a lot of developers, and those developers co-innovate with them. I think that in order to master that, one of the reasons why Apple masters it is has a very strong sense of what its customer base is really about and what it does to improve the lives of those people. And that's why I started the presentation with that quote, that really good companies change people and they change them for the better. And to illustrate that now, I'm going to divert and talk a little bit about these two gentlemen, William Henry Perkins and Wallace Carruthers. And Perkins was a 19th century chemist, and I think has a very close relationship with something like the Samsung S4. The connection is this, that what smartphone companies are trying to sell you right now is a better experience of colour. If you look at the S4, the reason it's one of the most advanced phones is it has something called phosphorescent OLED. It's the organic light emitting diodes in that phone are made of phosphorus or generated by phosphorescent light. And in the S4, they managed to introduce a green phosphorescent. And this may seem like an unnecessary technical detail for bankers, but the reason that I mention it is simply that they still can't do blue. So now you have red and green phosphorescent, and you have a much more luminescent phone. And humans engage with colour through luminescence. Sometime in the next 10 years, they might crack blue, which means we're going to get an even nicer phone. And the reason I mention it is simply that I think that what's happening in the smartphone industry and in many other industries is that it's our appreciation of colour. It's something that goes back a long, long way, and I'm going to illustrate some of that. If you go back through the history of television, it was that moment when we moved from black and white to colour television that colour television became a viral product, but also allowed us to grow a sense, of what colour is about. If you go back to the 18th century, these are actually painted by Monet, who was one of the first impressionists, the leaders of the impressionist movement. You're looking at an almost colourless built environment. Your built environment would be whitewash, leather, or wood. Perkins, actually just going forward, within 10 or 20 years, painters were representing a coloured physical built environment, even to the point of colouring bridges and things like that. And what was happening at that time is that we actually invented ways to paint things. So we had tins of paint for the first time, where you could take a tin of paint home and slap it on your house. You could paint your interior. Wallpaper, the kinds of machines that would print wallpaper were invented round about 1890. So again, in this period, people started to decorate their houses. It began with Perkins, the man who first synthesized purple and democratized the colour purple, a colour which in the past had been the preserve of monarchy and popes and higher clergy. And through that grew almost Apple-like. The Apple iPad of the 19th century was actually colour. And it had a tremendous effect. And I want to just keep on with this point because colour is what drove industry in the 19th century. We always think about industry as technology, as steam power, as all these types of things, but it's actually the human appreciation of colour, the human desire to enrich their lives drove massive industries. And those industries included companies like IG Farben, Hitler's chief industrial supporter. Farben means colour or dye stuff in German, and it was composed of the major German dye stuff companies. On the other side of the English Channel, the company that managed the Tube Allies project, which became the Manhattan Project, which became the atomic bomb, was ICI, which began as a dyestuffs company. So actually a huge amount of political, military, social power was driven by colour. And that's what I think the speaker this morning was trying to say, that through, we have this kind of imbalance where we tend to think of business as having its own momentum. Business makes things and sells them to us, but actually it's all about how successfully businesses interact with our need to grow as humans. So I would call it something like the broadening of human senses. I think that's the success of capitalism. Carruthers, another character I introduced earlier, invented nylon. The relevance of that is that by about 1945, women were able to wear nylon stockings. By the 1960s, they were able to use lycra in the stockings as well, and you got rid of these garters that women used to use. Designers started to shorten the female skirt, and you started to reveal sexuality in public places in a way which had never been done before. So although you might say, look, nylon is a very successful product, it's actually this transformation of human sexuality, and one culmination of that, 1968, the Summer of Love. Its real relevance is how we felt about each other and what we were able to see and experience, and also the transformation of that, or the representation of that in song. So if you look at the 1960s onwards, music becomes a big driver of industry. And it's actually one of the biggest drivers of the web right now. So you look at iTunes, the iPod, and then the iPhone. Those iconic products are driven by music, and also mostly by this desire we have to understand this romantic love, the resurgence of romantic love from the 1960s onwards. Spotify, Google's new music service, Pandora, they're all new ways in which we're trying to lay that soundtrack down to our lives, or keep that soundtrack of our lives with us all the time. So I think that, if you start to appreciate that business is really driven by these emotions, then you have to, as a bank, start thinking about trust and what's happening to trust, and how people's sense of trust is changing, and how people are reforming trust, because I think that by and large they're trying to reform it away from big business. About 3 or 4 weeks ago, there was an article on Forbes.com about a new app. And this app allows you to join campaigns against companies from your iPhone and from your supermarket trolley. So with your app, you can scan any product and it will tell you who is the original owner of the company that's making that product. The site that built the app had to close down temporarily because so many people wanted to download it. There were 8 downloads a second, and they just weren't geared up for that. They're a small startup. And the article itself had 800,000 readers on Forbes within 5 days, which again is a phenomenal number of readers for a Forbes article. So people are trying to reformulate their relationships with business. They want to take control of it, and they want to express dissatisfaction or a moral system that business may not realize is far more important than their products or their brand. And I think it relates very much to this external environment that I was talking about earlier, because in this external world, we have this much more social language around business. We talk about peers and peer networks, about social reputation, about social networks and ecosystems and social business and crowdfunding and crowdsourcing. This is not the language of business we had 5 years ago, but it's the kind of language that's driving many of the kind of applications like boycott. And I think that we've reached a stage actually where you could almost argue that there's an alternative way to do business, which doesn't involve the capital structure, the capital system that we relied on in the past. And I'll just go through that very quickly. If you wanted to initiate a new product now as a company, it could be you, it could be Google, it could be a small company, it could be Pebble Watch, you could actually open up that desire to a community online and say, give me ideas about what you think I could do as a business. And plenty of companies have done it. We saw it with Google Glass. What should we use this product for? You can then go to a developer or content ecosystem and ask them what they would develop with this product, which again, we've seen. You can go to your customer base, again, online, and ask people, well, what do you think about these ideas? Should we have a vote, or should we just listen to the feedback from a customer base? And then you can say, well, actually, as a business, I don't quite know how to validate these ideas. I don't know whether I should make an investment. I'll go to Kickstarter and I'll seek funding from the kinds of people that might buy the product. And there are plenty of big companies thinking about doing that now. So far, everything I've done is social. Everything I've done so far is trying to build relationships with people around an idea that started through my relationships with people. I can then go and validate that product through the crowd, and through crowdfunding. I've probably done a pretty good job of validating it. I can start to market it through a system known as double incentive marketing. I can offer every purchaser of my product a 20% reduction if they'll introduce my product to somebody else and that introduction leads to a sale, and that person will get 20% off. It's how Dropbox went from 0 to a 600 million valuation in less than 2 years, and very established now in the startup world, double incentive marketing. You can also co-create the information around that. So if you know enough bloggers, you can start to create interest around your product, and you can start to create interest around your brand just through the social layer, the Facebook, Twitter, blogging layer. You can go on and launch your product through those same channels. And once it's out there in the economy, it can actually be shared with other people. You can get, you'll hear about it later on today, I think, the sharing economy. You can propagate your product through that sharing economy, and probably you can do customer self-service with that product. So there's no reason for people to come back to you to ask, how do I use this product? You can set up a website and do customer self-service. So my point about that sequence is that you can pretty much do what you want without touching the established business world. And basically what you're doing with every step of the way is redesigning trust. And you're often doing these things with people that you've never met. A lot of my business takes place with people I've never met. And I'm sure there are many people out there that do this. So we're willing to make use of very weak ties. And in the past, most business relationships have depended on stronger ties. So now we're starting to build on this, the capability of the internet to give you weak ties and to build business through weak ties. My argument is that's a substantially different model of business and a substantially different take on trust. And what's happening in your business environment is that your customers are involved in these things, and they are redesigning how they feel about other people and their willingness to invest in other people and invest their future and trust in other people. There's also a very good example, I think, that I'll run through quickly of how that new sense of trust is generating a new value system. And a lot of people that start businesses used to have to go to the VC, and the VC would have this requirement that, okay, if you're going to take our money, we're going to take your lifestyle away, and we're going to work you to death. You're going to push your startup to 20, 30, 40 times our original investment, or we're not interested. Actually, what we're starting to see with crowdfunding is a quite different orientation from investors, and often professional investors who get involved in crowdfunding. Instead of that company-based must-scale VC model, crowdfunding tends to be project-based, and it tends to have no growth requirement. It has an achievement requirement, and that's a moral requirement. Please don't just take my money and run. Please do what you say you're going to do. In VC models, there's a very high assumption rate, a very high failure assumption rate. Sometimes people talk about 1 in 20 projects succeed, 19 in 20 fail. There is no assumption written into the crowdfunding model, no assumption of that nature. Whereas the VC model is very high stress for project proposers and becomes a barrier to many entrepreneurs who just can't cope with that lifestyle. There is no self-imposed outcome burden in crowdfunding. The VC model is very antagonistic towards lifestyle type projects. Again, crowdfunding, at least in its non-equity form, tends to be quite culture friendly. And whereas the VC model is all about my exit route, how do I get my money out? It's very often the case in a crowdfunded model that you're not getting money out, you're getting the product out. And that tends to actually work as a positive loop for crowdfunded projects, that if money does come out, people tend to reinvest it. And whereas you've got this kind of utilitarian, let's make cash VC model, in crowdfunded projects, you very often operate on the basis of extras. So you've put your money in, you have some sense of expectation of return, but what you're often buying is involvement. So if you back a movie, you want to be at the premiere, you want to shake hands with the stars, you want to talk to the director. So this sense that you get social extras out of it is a very important aspect of crowdfunding. So I'm going to summarize very quickly, because I think that there's a sense in large organizations, particularly financial organizations, that crowdfunding is going nowhere. But I know governments now that are looking at how they generate crowdfunding projects in their countries. And I know very large enterprises that are saying actually crowdfunding makes more sense to us as a way to leverage our innovation portfolio than traditional capital does. Because if I'm just going to rely on a capitalist source of money to leverage my product into the market, then I'm into this pretense game. Yeah, okay, I can scale my production to 10,000 models. I'm going to sell 9,000 in the first 2 months and 25,000 in the second month. You don't go through that pretense anymore with a crowdfund model. You get 2,000 people to invest, and they are your first 2,000 customers. So a lot of large companies are looking at that and saying, that's probably the best way to validate my product portfolio than actually pretending that I'm going to sell a whole bunch of them and then hoping for the best. So to summarize, I think where we are with things is we have these platforms and ecosystems that are a new means to scale. And I think they go hand in hand with this device economy and this narrow innovation. I think they drive the externalization of enterprise processes. So I think that many organizations will redesign their strategies around a much more fluid sense of who they are and what their expertise is. And I think that even at the level of capital, which is the most interesting aspect of this, even at the level of capital, we're redesigning trust. And we're redesigning values. I think we are moving away from this idea of surplus capital for its own sake, because we've seen what it does. You know, surplus capital on the scale we now produce it gives you a 1% wealth, 1% population that is so wealthy that it actually becomes useless to society. So I think we're moving away from that, and it's happening from the ground upwards, and it's happening in your customer base. And the end product of all that is I believe we're moving towards a new value system that really clever banks or really clever financial institutions will see themselves as a part of, or see themselves as being able to be a part of, because there's actually there is no reason for antagonism in that set of relationships. Okay, so that's my few ideas, and